Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Family Financial Conversation. I'm your co-host, Tom West, with my esteemed co-host, Suzanne Schmitt. Today is an interesting topic. When Suzanne and I were prepping for this, we sort of zeroed in on the idea of unretirement. So much of what financial advisors are focusing on during the working years of their clients is how to prepare for an independent, financially secured lifestyle that takes care of required and discretionary expenses. We try to anticipate things like taxes and healthcare, but sometimes our clients find that things aren't going according to plan, and their perceptions of retirement aren't what they thought they were going to be on the other side, and then they reverse course. So today's podcast, the opportunities and perils of unretirement. So hopefully that sets us up pretty good. Suzanne, unretirement as a topic was your idea. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done to sort of get us straight on how a good place to begin?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to see you, Tom. I think unretirement is really interesting, particularly as we are now, knock wood, well out of the height of COVID, where a lot of folks, especially young folks, retired early, and we're seeing a trend where they're having to come back into the workforce. So I think it's important to define what is unretirement. It sounds kind of like what we think it is, but there are two key criteria that experts agree have to be met. One, an individual acknowledges they are no longer working for income, and two, they self-declare that they are retired. So if we start with that definition and we kind of connect back to what happened during COVID, what we are seeing en masse, and this is not a flash in the pan, research finds that 26% of all people retired are or intend to return back to work. And what's interesting is 35% of those who are considered younger retirees, so these are those folks that likely went out early during COVID, in their 50s, are all back at work. This is by no means a small percentage of the population. But what we find when we look at unretirement is it's really happening for three primary reasons. One, people financially just are not comfortable with where they are without that consistent income. And that could be a combination of income itself or the benefits that come with full-time or part-time employment, which is not insignificant. So folks are kind of staring down the barrel of the cost of healthcare, as an example, and they are coming back to work. So we've got people looking for income. We've got people looking for some benefit supplementation. And then we've got a group of people, and this is particularly true of those who are very well schooled and well skilled. So think about your professors, your doctors, your healthcare workers. Those people just miss their social network. They really saw a lot and see a lot of their sense of self and sense of being as being derived from their work. And when they leave work, they miss it. They do not have friends outside of work. And so frankly, they go back to work because they miss the social contact.
Well, when I was reflecting back on my own practice and the hundreds of clients that we've served over the last 20, 25 years, I'd probably say that number, 25% of folks unretiring, that seems a little high relative to my experience as a planner, and it probably should be. I would imagine that if we did our job right as a financial advisor, maybe on that first one, people that needing to come back because of income, I'd like to think that as a financial advisor, maybe I did a better job of level setting some of our clients about the realities of what income and expenses might look like on the other side. So for financial advisors that are listening, when we're trying to think of that 25% that might be unretiring, how many of your clients really just don't have a realistic look at the financial aspects of what life looks like on the other side? But as we're talking about this income thing, because we're going to be speaking about each of these things in turn, income and benefits and the sort of the psychosocial side of things, what I can say is of my clients that have unretired based on the financial situation wasn't what they thought it was going to be, there's sort of two ways that I would reflect on it. The first one is there's a new variable that presents itself that maybe wasn't fully appreciated as a possibility. And in my experience, it usually falls into two categories. There's a healthcare event, and it isn't necessarily the healthcare event on my client directly. A lot of times it's a spouse or a parent that they all of a sudden have to start financing. Or we certainly saw this a lot at COVID, adult children who have aged into a place where there's a realization on my clients, the parents, that this is not tracking that my child is going to be financially independent in the way that I was thinking or I was hoping for. So some of the clients that are coming back from an income standpoint, I'd probably say there was a circumstance that sort of changed. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then the second one is certainly we spend a lot of time on the family financial conversation about longevity and the costs of getting old and senior housing and healthcare. The other one is I see some of my clients anticipating a legacy, either in a spoken or an unspoken way, that they see some attrition on the part of that older generation, of the attrition of an estate dealing with the costs of care and whatnot. And that second one is sort of a tricky one. Let's start on the first one. Let's talk a little bit about, Suzanne, research and what you think about the idea of folks coming back after an event that changes the perceptions, changes the assumptions on how they were going to build their retirement. What does your research say about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. So studies find that the average age of retirement is getting younger and younger. And right now it is currently pegged at 62. And the majority of people who are going out at 62 are going out because of a health issue themselves or because they are caring for somebody with a health issue. So starting there, we see a couple of things happen. One, people are going out anywhere between 5 on average and 7 to 10 years earlier than they planned. So there's immediately a gap in their retirement planning portfolio. But they're also drawing down funds while in those early years because healthcare is expensive. We know Fidelity pegs the average amount retirees spend at $315,000, and that's exclusive of major events, unforeseen things, and even long-term care. So people that go out that early, especially if you're the caregiver and you are generally healthy, oftentimes have to go back because you are experiencing events that you have not financially prepared for. Point one. Point two, I think, is really interesting, and that is the majority of retirement plans really don't look at the family dynamic. So to your point, whether it's a child's failure to thrive or it's an older person's financial or social or emotional dependency on that, let's say, adult child, those are all very real variables that are forcing people to go back. And the third thing that you raised, which is also really interesting, some additional research by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College finds that there's a bit of a wealth illusion among even the highest earners in your book. So they peg high earners at $248,000 annually, which is a pretty healthy income. They find that 32% of those people in that high income bracket are not financially prepared for retirement because of failure to save and reliance on things that could include expectation of wealth transfer that simply isn't going to happen. Their parents, their older loved ones are having to tap into funds that they might have anticipated passing because they simply can't afford to fund their lifestyle or they're facing down the barrel of a health event or a long-term care event themselves. So it's a complicated scenario.
Okay, so those are three things and a lot of numbers. Let's talk about the first one. When you said average retirement age at 62, like not with my clients, and I think that there's probably a little bit of parsing to do on that. I would imagine that's a global number. It's including a lot of blue collar work. I would probably say, broadly speaking, my clients and the clients of many financial advisors that have sufficient investments to be able to afford financial advice on a regular basis, that's got to be skewing more white collar and older. Is there anything in there that the data that you're looking at sort of pulls that direction? Because my experience is 62 is not an average. It's probably closer to mid 60s to late 60s, but that's anecdotal.
Yeah, so we know your book is not average, and
right.
You provide a very full range of services, but that 62 number is actually domestic.
That's
and
interesting.
You will see, even among, again, highly skilled, high-income workers, There are people like doctors, in some cases, surgeons, specifically dentists, who may have repetitive use injuries. It is not as much as we might want to say it's niche to a certain class or a certain form of work. It isn't. That really does cut across a lot. And again, I go back to a number of those folks are not going out because they want to. They're going out because they have to, because they have care needs in the household that require them to be there full time. They can't make it work, both working and having people come in to help their spouse or partner.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you pushed back on that. I think that's appropriate for me and for advisors that are listening to sort of re-examine their book and not necessarily make the assumption that 65 to 70 and when do I take Social Security and can I kick it out to my 70s? That's not where the averages are. So that's something that's helpful. The second thing that you talked about with folks that had unexpected, unanticipated needs that's forcing them to unretire, you mentioned something that a lot of retirement planning doesn't take account broader family, where I think our financial advisor audience can really benefit from this. When you're doing your retirement plan, I've always found that a really simple technique of tracking everybody's age, like on a spreadsheet at the same time, is really helpful about giving our clients sort of a pause to consider what's going on around them. So for example, if I've got a client that's planning for retirement and they're 60, well, if you're going to be retiring at age 65, how old is your spouse? How old is your adult kids? How old are your parents at that point? One of the most interesting things that I see across my whole client base is their parents, one or both of them being alive when they retire, was not baked into their financial assumptions when they started to retire. So just some longevity tracking. How old will other people in the family be at different inflection points? And Mrs. Client, like when you're 60, when you're 70, when you're 80, how old are your kids going to be? 30 and 40 and 50 and whatnot. Where might they be in their life? Are there any things that we need to consider in terms of that broader family implication of what responsibilities of our money might be? And does that influence at all our perceptions of security in terms of a particular retirement date? So I'm glad you pulled that one out. I think the interesting one, in my opinion, is this illusion of wealth. And you mentioned that, what would we say, 30-something% of people earning $250 or more have unrealistically sanguine and happy perceptions of how financially secure they are. Like that one hit the bullseye for me. My experience with a number of different clients, some of which I've had to exit from my practice, they show symptoms of this. My lifestyle requires me to need a 12% net rate of return in order for me to retire at the time of my choosing. So even though I understand that's riskier, that's what I'm hiring you to do. These are not clients that you really want to necessarily have in your practice. The idea of, like, I certainly understand the psychology, and I've talked to a lot of my peers in the industry, that there's sort of two different perceptions about projecting retirement in retirement expenses. One of them is you solve for all of the required expenses first, housing, healthcare, groceries, that sort of stuff. And then on top of that, you solve for discretionary, the fun stuff, like, well, the cruises, the gifts, the charity, all those sorts of pieces. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I think that it's also useful to think of the second way that is just as appropriate, which is, I've had one client explain it to me this way. Tom, the reason I'm hiring you is because my discretionary expenses are my required expenses. And I'm not making the distinction because I'm not sort of a hand-to-mouth investor. Like, I want it all, and I need you as an advisor to maximize the probability that I'm able to do that. And in each of those cases, whether you're doing required and discretionary expenses separately or you're putting them all together, a good advisor, I'm enlisting the rest of my professionals. We should know the ways that we can talk about cost benefit of each of the different subcomponents of this. But I really agree with the idea that these $250,000 plus earners, there is a significant percentage of them that dramatically underestimate two things: healthcare and their perceptions of legacies that might be coming to them. And why don't you just spend a little bit of time on that wealth illusion thing? Because I think that from a professional class, that's a little underappreciated.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I had not come across it framed as such until taking a look at this research. So the notion is really that there's been mental accounting, future casted mental accounting done such that those expected inheritances become an offset to things like lifestyle creep and that lifestyle expectation. Oftentimes, it will involve deferred funding for children's college and school. It will involve deferred funding for paying off mortgages, or an assumption that monies that were loaned for small business startups and homes will not be required to be repaid. So that's another place that this wealth illusion can come up. But I think the key takeaway is really, and I'm going to put it back to you in the form of a question, how do you feel as an advisor about your need or requirement to get into that sort of kind of psychosocial, almost behavioral economics view of your client's wealth sources that might include expected inheritance? How's that work in the day-to-day practice for you?
Well, I think I've got two thoughts hitting me at the same time. I think that my job is to advise my clients and hopefully influence small decisions that in aggregate drive better outcomes for the clients according to their hierarchy of priorities. Like, that's what I think my job is. And when there's an alignment problem, which is the choices that they're making don't line up with the priorities that they express, sometimes this is an education component. If these are the things that are important to you, this is what the important things cost. And these are the things that might go wrong. Let's go back and revisit the choices that we've got. The choices could be savings rates or current discretionary expenses or gifting or retirement dates or unretirement, those sorts of pieces. And I think that sometimes I believe it's my job, it's part of what they're paying for to be giving that advice. Now, there's another element, like how much of it is your job? Like everything that we know in our industry all boils down to net flows, right? So in my mind, I've got sort of two different sets of clients that I'm thinking about. What we're talking about today is this. I was thinking about, I've got older clients well into retirement that are navigating stuff. We touch on that a lot on Family Financial Conversation. But right now, we're talking about on either side of this retirement threshold. For those clients right there, coming back on this wealth illusion and lifestyle creep, and what are the implications of mentally accounting for a legacy that may or may not come. I think that this is an under-addressed area for our profession. There's a few things that are going on. The first one is, I think it feels unnatural on the part of a lot of adult children who hire financial advisors to express out loud mental accounting for legacies. Like, it feels creepy that, like, listen, I'm counting the $2 million or the $500,000 that mom's going to leave me whenever she passes away, and I've sort of pre-spent that on this stuff so I don't have to save for it. You're not going to have a whole lot of clients like volunteering that information. So I'll give you a technique, advisor audience. I think that the idea of a lot of the mental accounting that people do have to do with money that isn't theirs, that is currently aimed at somebody else's priorities. Like, mom might want to stay home under all circumstances, for example. I think that there's always some utility at doing, at a minimum, a back of the napkin swag at what mom or dad's financial situation might look like, just to set a tone of, I'm trying to think ahead with you about maybe your own financial responsibilities for that older generation. And let's just make sure that if you have to step into a role as a successor decision maker or supporting a successor decision maker, these are the smart and the dumb ways to make decisions on behalf of that parent whose legacy you might be mentally accounting for. And then what I'll do is I'll sort of ask questions about, does that seem safe to you? Does that make you anxious? Any other thoughts that we've got to consider on that? I'll look for opportunities, particularly if I feel some confidence that, listen, mom and dad are probably going to be able to pay their own way. And even if they have significant expenses, there's probably some realistic amount left over. I will offer as an advisor in terms of anticipated windfalls down the road that there might be something coming your way. The biggest issue that I try to bring to my clients is what the timing of that might be. Because if most investors that have means to hire advisors that have a full service suite like we do, they tend to skew white collar, more educated, go to the doctor, take their medicine. That skews with life expectancy. That skews with they're probably not dying on schedule. They live a whole lot longer than anticipated. This is the same group that buys long-term care insurance. It's the same group that move into life plan communities and so on. And for those parents, I want to temper expectations on behalf of my clients that are thinking of retirement, unretirement, of money might be coming, but it might be coming when you're 70. Like it might not be coming when you're 50 or 60, something along those lines. So that's kind of some of the psychology that I use talking to my clients about that.
Got it. So I'm hearing temper your expectations, and you're helping your clients really avoid some magical thinking about resources that not only might not show up, but might show up significantly later than they're anticipating.
Right.
That really cares for perhaps the people that end up unretiring, because there's a financial reason they really need to rethink their strategy for the final chapter, if you would, of their lives. What do you think, though, about the people that are unretiring because they just missed the social connection? How do you care for that in your planning process?
Well, I mean, in some ways, you remember the title of our things is The Perils and the Opportunities of Unretiring. To some degree, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Meaning, if you're financially secure, whether or not you go back to work, I don't think that I don't have any big heartburn about do what makes you happy. If you thought you would be fully occupied and socialized and you're not, well then get back and be socialized and do the thing that makes you happy. Where I think that the challenge is when unretiring due to psychosocial issues costs a lot of money and has a lot of financial implications. Advice that I will give is before moving out of the area, I live in a relatively expensive sort of urban area, and that's where a lot of, not all, but many of my clients are. And there's expressions of, I'm going to move to somewhere warm, somewhere less expensive, the rest of it. It's hugely important for me to say, how about maybe you rent before you buy? Just to be able to make this decision of moving somewhere else as part of this psychosocial thing, revocable. Remember, optimized decisions race to make a revocable decision. So I would offer that for folks that I believe there might be a risk of some of the psychosocial unretirement stuff, I'm trying to figure out ways to mitigate the financial risks of changing your mind. So for my clients that can afford making that particular mistake in unretiring, what are the smart things to do to keep your sort of options open? And that's a lot of the language that I use. What happens if you don't like it? I think we should have that discussion. What happens if you don't like it? I think the other piece too, and we were talking about this before, retirement doesn't exist in a vacuum many times. Just because I might want to retire doesn't mean my wife wants to retire at the same time. Or what happens if we have a gap in ages? And my perception of retirement is I would hang out a lot with my spouse who has no intention of retiring. Well, I'm drumming my fingers quite a bit, waiting for a playmate. And I always like to think, what is everybody else that's material to your psychosocial well-being, where will they be on both sides of your retirement decision?
Good counsel. Is there anything that you think is really important for people that are contemplating? I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And maybe they're still on the work side of retirement, but they're thinking about more of a phased retirement. This notion of phased retirement is taking on a lot of popularity, seeing very different responses from a workplace perspective. But as you look at your clients who might be, let's say, 5 to 10 years in striking distance of retirement, how are you thinking about phased retirement considerations in your practice?
I'll start by saying my first impression of phased retirement, I mean, I hate to be a consistent cynic, but it's the same as sort of holistic financial wellness. There's a lot of Peter Pan thinking in some of this phased retirement, exactly which professions do you phase retirement out of? It's not a surgeon. There's certainly plenty of industries that have mandatory retirement ages. All this healthcare stuff that we're talking about, well, you don't get to phase on intentionally as much. I think that there's entire professions that their whole professional discipline is changing. I'm not going to pick on any of my other professionals right now, but like AI is a thing, and there's a lot of jobs that you're not going to be able to go back to, and there's no phasing. You're just out because your productivity has been replaced with a computer program in the next 2 years. I also think that from a benefits management standpoint, like we know when somebody leaves, like we've got an industry that is very adept at exiting folks off of benefits, off of retirement, the rest of it. And you don't see those kinds of programs that large employers have for benefits, for example. There's not like an easy button to come back in on a phased retirement side of things. So a lot of times, maybe you're talking about 1099 income on the side if you're lucky enough to have a profession that your work product, your content, your intellectual property, your experience retains some value. But phased retirement that I've seen most successfully done, I'm not saying it's never done. I see it done relatively frequently. But you usually want to start thinking about, you're in business for yourself now. Phased retirement doesn't mean you're working for your old employer the same way, but less. Like that's not what it looks like for most of my clients. It's 1099s. There aren't any benefits. You have to backfill all of your Medicare, Social Security, health insurance. You've got to do your retirement savings differently, those sorts of pieces. And I think that the other two factors that we started with phased retirement, that's a lot of the guidance that I give my team and the guidance that I give my clients. Is the reason for phased retirement because you need the income? Is the reason for phased retirement because you're bored? Is the reason for phased retirement because there's an unexpected health event or a perception, like wishful thinking on legacy and whatnot? I think that the root cause of planned phased retirement is material in the kind of advice you're giving. But I think that phased retirement in some ways is wishful thinking for a lot of folks that just expect that I might be able to dial it down. That is, I will say this though, most of my clients, when they're thinking of retirement, will proactively bring up the idea of phased retirement because really from a psychological standpoint, this is an opportunity in the moment to kick the can on a decision. You're like, if it's phased retirement, that means that I don't really have to necessarily zig or zag right now. I can kind of wing it for a little bit longer. I always think it's important to hold your clients accountable for decisions that need to be made and think carefully, advisors that are listening, about whether phased retirement, what are the root causes behind it? Are they psychosocial? Are there new information? Is it benefits chasing? That sort of stuff. Let that be your guide in terms of helping to set your clients' expectations about what's coming.
Good stuff. And in terms of, we talked, like you said at the top of the podcast, about the rewards and the perils, or the risks and the perils. What are your thoughts about Social Security and considerations there specifically to either a phased retirement or somebody coming out of retirement and doing the unretirement thing?
I think practically speaking, in terms of how much income you're able to make, what's the tax implications of that at the different ages and whatnot, to some degree, I think that that's part of the cash flow projections that advisors should be making to help level set your clients in terms of, anticipating what's coming. In terms of the timing of the social, I would probably say mostly it has to do with timing. When do I take Social Security? Do I continue to defer to the max age possible and get the 0.5% every year and so on? Then you're talking about sort of gap funding between when somebody retires and making up for the Social Security and whatnot. In my mind, I have found that the Social Security calculus is secondary to this concept of retiring and unretiring for those big three things. Like, let's plan for the unexpected. Let's figure out the psychosocial stuff. Let's zero in a little bit more on what a phased retirement might realistically or not realistically look, and then use the Social Security calculus as a way to sort of throughput your advice and best decisions. But I typically let those bigger things be the dog and Social Security is the tail. The decision on the Social Security is begat by those other priorities. So that's basically the way that I would do it.
Got it. And I've got one more question for you, and that is, I'll go back to some recent research from T. Rowe, and they find that about 48% of people who are going back for financial reasons, that's inclusive of healthcare issues. I'm curious, given that healthcare and both access to care, access to insurance more specifically, and also having a health event are driving so much activity about people coming in and out of the workforce as they're in their retirement years. What are your thoughts about the role, not just of healthcare planning, but really understanding your client's current situation and then branching into that next generation? How do you think about all of those complex variables, particularly for the folks in your book that are approaching retirement? How do you help them think through all those trade-offs and different scenario plans that they really need to work through to hopefully have this be a smooth and happy transition for them?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll start by saying it's really important, I think, for financial advisors to start incorporating healthcare and healthcare expectations in their planning. We know that study last year, Alliance for Lifetime Income, basically shown that financing healthcare is now Americans' number one retirement fear, more than running out of money. So the consumer market is telling us as advisors that this healthcare stuff matters. Materially, how I'm looking at my book, I think healthcare and changes in healthcare are the most predictable bringer of chaos in somebody's retirement, unretirement life. If I was going to be taking a look at what's the single thing, it's not the psychosocial, it's not the benefits thing. There's usually a healthcare issue that cascades into decisions and feelings of anxiety that I can't stop working because I'm worried about the thing. I think bringing this up, I'm glad that you dropped in access to healthcare in addition to paying for healthcare. It remains a surprise to too many Americans and too many financial advisors, frankly, that we live in a world where knowing where to get the healthcare and get the quality healthcare and have access to the healthcare is in and of itself an expense most of the time, discrete from actually paying for the care. Whether you're talking about physicians that are no longer taking Medicare directly. You and I were laughing about this earlier. I just had a bunch of dental work. Well, my dental insurance isn't paying for any of that, but I still have to have access to different stuff. I think that the idea of access to healthcare, access to long-term care, access to senior housing, I always want to level set with my clients that this is the most predictable thing that's going to go left. Let's make sure that we scenario build around that. Let's make sure that we consider all of the other family members around, hypothetically you, in this retirement, unretirement scenario, so we can at least get a running start on how decisions might be made when things don't turn up as confidently as we were hoping. And my last thought on that, and we'll close on this. Remember, advisors, when you address the unspoken anxiety in the room, whether it's, I was expecting this inheritance and it's not coming, I'm worried about healthcare. When you address these things, that's when you're impacting the relationship so positively. That's when your stick rate for being able to remain the advisor of choice at the death or disability of a first spouse, if you're able to comment on the financial implications of healthcare transitions for an older generation, everything about our business is net flows. Everything is leaky bucket. How can we make an impact in the course of our regular advice for our clients to be able to really find some value and to stick around and maybe have their kids stick around too? So that's a great question to close on. Thank you, Suzanne, for this article. It's been an interesting topic, retirement and unretirement, so I appreciate that. Any other last thoughts before we sign off?
I think my last thought should really be the notion that by solving for this uncertainty, particularly around healthcare, it's also a bridge for that advisor to connect with generations on either side of the client. So even though it's uncomfortable, I think ultimately it's a win for the advisor, it's a win for the client and the entire family, to your point around stickiness.
Sure. Well, the perils and the opportunities of unretirement. We're all looking for wins, and hopefully this was a win podcast for everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Find this link on advisorpedia.com, and appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered in the podcast represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure. Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.